Good morning, and hopefully you should be in A4, Floodplain Management for Policy. I'm Kathy Holder, the Utah State Floodplain Manager, and today's initial speaker for this session is it's going to be ESA and the NFIP, Protecting Endangered Species in Pacific Northwest Floodplains. Presenters are Erin Cooper, CFM Floodplain Management Special, and FEMA from FEMA, and Bry Harrison, CFM NFIP ESA Specialist from FEMA.
Great. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for listening and watching, whether you're attending ASFPM live here today or if you're listening to this months into the future. My name is Erin Cooper, and I'm the Senior ESA NFIP Specialist with FEMA Region 10. Brian and I are here to talk with you today about endangered species habitat considerations in the eyes of floodplain management and the National Flood Insurance Program. We'll be focusing on floodplain management, but in order to understand why we're talking about habitat, we need to explain how the NFIP overlaps with the Endangered Species Act. The ESA went into law in 1973 and is the primary law in the United States for protecting imperiled species. Its purpose is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems on which they depend. Two federal agencies are tasked with administering the ESA, the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The National Marine Fisheries Service primarily protects or works on issues related to marine wildlife, including whales and anadromous species such as salmon. And the Fish and Wildlife Service primarily works with terrestrial and freshwater organisms. Today, we'll focus on our four main ways that the ESA has brought a sharper focus on the National Flood Insurance Program performance standards in an environmental light and in specifically 2 states within the Pacific Northwest. We'll discuss the critical habitats and listed species at the center of that environmental light, the role of the NFIP in ESA compliance, where that policy language may leave something to be desired in relation to built versus natural environments, and how communities can look downriver with us as floodplain management practices of the past are reconsidered. So first, let's look at critical habitat in floodplains. So since the theme of this year's conference is all about resiliency in the West, I wanted to start with a general introduction of some salmon species living in the Pacific Northwest and western coastal states. Listed species in this part of the world include Chinook, chum, sockeye, and other salmonids like steelhead and cutthroat trout. Endangered species are not new to the Pacific Northwest, though. The state of Washington alone is home to 49 different listed species. As you can see from the map and the brown areas, freshwater streams, floodplains, and watersheds that these species call home are extensive throughout Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and California. These watersheds provide habitat for salmon upstream from the coast and into the mountains. Floodplains are important to fish because they provide shelter from fast-moving water during floods, and because the use of the land near a river or stream determine whether the fish will have the food, shade, and clean water they need to be healthy. So let's take a look at some of the communities existing alongside our salmon. We'll zoom in a little closer to see the major channels for the freshwater habitat in the greater Puget Sound watershed. This map identifies each community in which NFIP communities, or each county in which NFIP communities are subject to the unique NFIP standards that we're here to talk about today. In total, 122 participating communities are located within the Puget Sound watershed, and the participating municipalities on this watershed are shown in the map in blue. So the listed threatened and endangered species of concern in the Puget Sound watershed are shown here, and these are 4 salmonid species plus the distinct population segment of the southern resident killer whales. Similarly, a separate biological opinion was issued by the NOAA Fisheries for habitat impacts in the state of Oregon for the watersheds that you see in tan here. Same as in the Puget Sound, the boundary of this impact is driven by natural and sometimes man-made obstructions, but the general area follows watersheds. And the majority of NFIP participating communities within the state of Oregon actually fall within this boundary. So the species highlighted in the biological opinion for the state of Oregon are more extensive. The salmonids you see here, plus their subspecies, Eulachon, which is a feeder fish, the green sturgeon, and again the southern resident killer whales are identified as impacted by the implementation of the NFIP. So why are we talking about all of this? If you're not sure why the National Flood Insurance Program, or what the National Flood Insurance Program has to do with salmon, you're definitely not alone. It all has to do with the requirement of federal programs to comply with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. So let's dig into that a little bit. As a federal agency, FEMA is required to ensure that its actions taken through federal programs comply with the Endangered Species Act. The tricky part here is that the NFIP is a voluntary program that is implemented locally by local governments. Because of this, the participating cities, counties, and tribes permit floodplain development that can reduce the quality and quantity of fish habitat. As a result, and in these specific two geographic areas, FEMA is looking to change what is asked of local and tribal governments as a condition of participating in the voluntary program. This all comes back to language in the Code of Federal Regulations that states that floodplain permits must be obtained for floodplain development and that the work must comply with ESA rules. This became a highlighted issue in Washington and then in Oregon when litigation was brought to suggest that FEMA wasn't doing enough to address floodplain impacts on endangered species in these watersheds. The path forward for clearing that question up is to proceed with a federal consultation between the action agency, in this case FEMA, and the services, in this case NOAA Fisheries. The goal of each of the consultations was to determine whether the minimum standards of the NFIP, as implemented by FEMA, jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat of such species. A federal consultation process with the services results in at least the publication of a biological opinion, or BIOP as we like to call it. NOAA Fisheries completed BIOPs for both the Washington and Oregon consultations, and both resulted in jeopardy determinations. A jeopardy determination requires an additional report to be issued with the BIOP called a reasonable and prudent alternative. The RPA is just that, a reasonable alternative to the current action being implemented. The RPAs each provided a suggested path forward for FEMA to implement the NFIP in a different way in order to avoid continued jeopardy to the listed species through continued destruction of their critical habitat. So to give you a sense of all the timelines for these events, here are a few dates. It's the federal government, so things do take a while. In the Puget Sound, litigation was brought in 2004, the RPA issued in 2008, and then the alternative standards for the NFIP implementation began being implemented in 2014. And in Oregon, the litigation was brought in 2009, and an RPA was issued in 2016. Before implementation could begin, however, there was a required extension in our process due to the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. So as a result of that pause, we've revisited the original implementation plan and are developing a new approach for implementation that should be ready for NEPA review sometime next year. So before I hand it off to Briar to get into the details of how we're working with Puget Sound communities to implement this alternative framework, I wanted to just point out that what we're talking about today is a glimpse of what could be a sort of new normal for the greater NFIP community nationwide. So the blue outline states that you see here indicate where ESA consultations have been completed for NFIP implementation concerns regarding listed species, and the yellow outline state, California, is where ESA consultation is already currently underway. So my point here is that it's not just a Pacific Northwest problem, and it's not just a salmon problem. The California consultation is related to listed salmon species as well, but there are listed species living in coastal and riverine floodplains throughout the country that may be subject to future litigation. Other consultations show us that it's not just fish. So hopefully what we share with you today can help you and your local floodplain partners work toward NFIP implementation that protects these critical habitat areas. So with that, I'll turn it over to Briar.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. I'm Briar Harris, the other half of the ESA NFIP team at Region 10. I'm going to give a brief overview of how we've been implementing the Puget Sound BIOP at the local level. So after FEMA received the Jeopardy opinion and RPA from NIMFs from NOAA Fisheries, the team at Region 10 began developing a strategy to help local communities understand how their floodplain management responsibilities and authorities have been expanded by the findings of the BIOP. It's important to note that although the RPA pushed for systematic changes in the bedrock of the NFIP minimums, the NFIP is a national program, and any changes to the federal code would affect how the program operates nationwide. So it was up to Region 10 to develop some robust guidance to support each unique community in devising a method for managing development in their SFHAs without further jeopardizing threatened species. What we came up with is what we call the 3 doors. These are each voluntary levels of ordinance amendment that provide roughly 3 types of ESA compliance strategies. We'll break down each one for a bit more detail. I'm actually going to start with door 3 because this is the default category that all Puget Sound communities are in until they adopt the ordinance changes characteristic to other strategies, door 1 and 2. Door 3 is known as the permit by permit approach. With no ordinance changes, the responsibility lies entirely on the permitter to ensure that every project proposal for development in the special flood hazard area includes rigorous analyses of all the potential impacts to the quality and function of the habitat of listed species at that location. It's important to remember that this is not just about in-water work. Critical salmon habitat includes lands extending above ordinary high water for sometimes significant distances. Because those uplands affect water quality and quantity, they affect nutrient exchange, and they provide refuge habitat during flood events. So the analysis that must be included in a permit application needs to cover 4 general elements. 1, it needs to cover a detailed description of the existing habitat, its quality and function, what's there before the project happens. 2, detailed description of the proposed development, including all construction activities and additional impervious surfaces, etc. 3, an assessment of the potential impacts of all development activities to each of the specific habitat elements lined out in the BIOP. And 4, a demonstration that the quality and function of habitat will not be adversely impacted or degraded either during construction or after the project is complete. This is necessarily a simplified explanation of the analysis needed, but it's clearly a lot of information, additional information, that's not traditionally part of a floodplain application. The benefit of the door 3 approach is that it requires no ordinance amendments or other upfront effort on the part of the community in terms of community-wide planning or public hearings. But there are a number of drawbacks. Although it may not require adoption of new regulations, being a door 3 community does require the development of complex internal processes to ensure that permits are issued in full ESA compliance. It also places tremendous pressure on permitters to fully understand the BIOP requirements, to assess the impacts of each individual project, and to require detailed and often costly analysis from permit applicants without the support of adopted ordinance and regulations. It also provides no coded guidance to the public in the form of ordinance amendments or comprehensive planning as to the new requirements to obtain floodplain permits, which can result in permit applicants being surprised by the additional requirements and possibly upset that they had not budgeted the funds or time to hire someone to perform the needed analysis. So if the default compliance option is door 3, the permit by permit approach, what are the other strategies Region 10 has developed to help communities meet the BIOP requirements? Door 1 is the adoption of a unique model ordinance that Region 10 developed in cooperation with a variety of local and agency partners. It's a standalone ordinance that covers all minimum NFIP and Washington state regulations regarding floodplain management, as well as additional sections that address habitat impacts. By combining more traditional floodplain management regulations with the detailed requirements about habitat analysis that's now an essential part of floodplain permitting decisions, the Door 1 ordinance attempts to capture the new reality of floodplain management in the Puget Sound, where it has been permanently expanded to take into consideration the impacts of development on the quality and function of habitat in the floodplain. Benefits of Door 1 include that it's kind of a package deal. If a community adopts this ordinance and demonstrates that it's being administered consistently and equitably, it's likely that they'll be collecting the right kinds of documentation to demonstrate ESA compliance. It's also easier to adopt prepackaged, pre-approved language than it might be to come up with your own plan. The Door 1 ordinance contains some quantifiable metrics, which is another important benefit. The RPA, being essentially recommendations, does not always provide strict methods for meeting the requirements of the BIOP. So we at Region 10 developed some tools, such as a balanced cut and fill requirement that hopefully make permitting decisions a little easier as a Door 1. Drawbacks of the Door 1 model ordinance include that it's got some cookie cutter kind of language. The Door 1 ordinance attempts to be a one-size-fits-all approach, but as it's written, it may not fit a community's specific needs. For instance, if a community already has a robust floodplain ordinance, it may not fit well to try to incorporate the Door 1 model ordinance language. So that can leave a community better suited to consider the Door 2 approach, which we'll talk about in a minute. The model ordinance also doesn't cover everything. It provides goalposts for ESA compliance, but a Door 1 community must still require any additional information on habitat impact analysis for any projects that don't fit inside the box of the model ordinance. And they still need to understand the unique habitat characteristics of their own community to know where those impacts have the greatest potential to do harm. The Door 2 approach covers two community-specific strategies. This is the strategy that's most sort of tailor-made for a specific community to adopt based on its own specific needs. There's the semi-programmatic approach and the community-wide programmatic habitat assessment. So in the semi-programmatic approach, a community conducts a broad assessment of its existing processes and procedures to see if the requirements of the BIOP are already being met by existing regulations. And if some component of ESA compliance is not currently in effect, then the community can adopt language from the model ordinance to fill in those gaps, or they can show how an alternative version of that item can be adopted in its place. To take things a step further, a community can perform a programmatic habitat assessment, where it makes a detailed evaluation of the watersheds in its SFHA and does an inventory of the quality and function of the critical habitat throughout the community. Combining this with an inventory of existing and future development plans, the community can develop regulations, buffers, mitigation banks, and other tools that together form a community-wide plan that addresses the concurrent goals of responsible development and the conservation of habitat function. In my mind, this is the ideal strategy. But a Door 2 plan can't just be an encyclopedia of the species and habitat in an area. It must also include a detailed description of how the plan will be carried out. There need to be details on day-to-day processes, position-specific responsibilities, and a practical approach to how the plan will actually be implemented. Benefits of the Door 2 include that both versions of the Door 2 strategy are community-driven and community-developed, which implies diverse input and diverse buy-in from community leaders and stakeholders, which hopefully translates into robust support for planners and permitters in their day-to-day decision-making processes. Door 2 plans are meant to be community specific and thus highlight the unique understanding and investment that local governments have in their own communities. The BIOP provides the goalposts, FEMA provides the support, but it's the local community that figures out how to incorporate that guidance into plans and regulations that reflect their own best hopes for future resiliency and the conservation of precious natural resources. The upfront work of the community likely reduces the need for permit applicants to provide expensive and rigorous analysis for each individual project. With clear requirements and goalposts pre-established, habitat conservation becomes part of the planning process for development and not an afterthought or unpleasant surprise at the permitting counter. Drawbacks of the Door 2 approach. The upfront work for the community, especially in the programmatic habitat assessment approach, can be considerable. Even if it ultimately reduces work on the permit-by-permit basis and reduces the likelihood of non-compliance, it's a heavy lift. Also, for anyone who's worked in local government, you know that those expensive plans that we work hard to develop often go on a shelf the day after they've been adopted. And then staff turnover and new administrations can result in that plan gathering dust and obscurity. But a detailed Door 2 plan can't go on the shelf. When the floodplain management team at Region 10 initiates a CAV, we'll have our own copy of that approved Door 2 plan and expect to see it referenced and followed in every permitting decision. So now I'll hand it back to Erin for a moment to talk about implementation in Oregon.
Thanks, Briar. So yeah, in Oregon, we're working with federal and state partners on an implementation planning process. In other words, we're seeking partner and stakeholder input on how best we can address the biological opinion's reasonable and prudent alternative through implementation strategies that fit within the state and local regulatory frameworks specific to Oregon. So we've been working with willing community participants and industry and non-governmental groups, as well as tribes, since our first workshop that we held back in February of 2020, to ask questions and obtain feedback on a new approach to implementation. At the core of our effort is a goal to make sure that the approach we take in Oregon is somewhat different than the three-door approach that Briar just described, because that's what the communities have asked for. So our work on this continues now in a virtual environment, and we hope to have a framework to carry forward later this year.
Thanks, Erin. Now we'll move on to talking about the built environment versus the natural environment in terms of floodplain management. For a lot of us in floodplain management, the addition of habitat impact analysis will feel like an awkward addition to programs that have traditionally been focused on flood safety, building regulations, and performance standards for insurable structures. But if we learned anything in the last century of battling flood hazards, it's that you can't fight the natural functions of floodplains. You can't stick a river in a pipe or a channel or even behind a levee and expect it to stay put and behave itself indefinitely. Floodplain management has evolved in its understanding of the public safety imperative of giving a river room wherever possible to behave naturally. This includes conserving or restoring vegetation, wetlands, and the myriad natural elements that comprise a functioning floodplain. And it's been in the federal mandate since the beginning. In Executive Order 11988 for floodplain management, Section 1 says that, quote, each agency shall provide leadership and shall take action to reduce the risk of flood loss, to minimize the impact of floods on human safety, health, and welfare, and to restore and preserve the natural and beneficial values served by floodplains in carrying out its responsibilities. So when you read this mandate, you might think that there's arguably been something missing from floodplain management in general. The elements of reducing flood loss and to minimize the impacts of floods on safety and welfare have made it down into the minimum performance standards that show up in every local ordinance, but not so much the restoration and preservation of natural and beneficial functions, which are the elements so essential both to long-term community resiliency as well as the future survival and viability of threatened salmon and orca in the Puget Sound and other threatened species that depend on floodplain habitat in the Pacific Northwest and across the country. Examples of the missing elements, the restoration and preservation of the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains, include the fact that the NFIP definition of development does not specifically include habitat alteration. In the Puget Sound, we suggest communities adopt a certain percentage of vegetation removal as an addition to this definition. Another classic example is the room and basic floodplain management regulations for unrestricted volumes of fill in the floodplain, including the heavy armoring of shorelines and riverbanks, as long as the proper H&H study is provided. If a community has not adopted its own regulations for the protection of natural and beneficial functions of floodplains, a reliance on the minimum performance standards required to participate in the NFIP may be far from adequate. The image you see here is a classic one we use in presentations in the Pacific Northwest. It's from the Skokomish River Valley in the Olympic Peninsula. And this sort of thing happens every year, salmon crossing the highway. And it's just not necessary. It could be prevented with low water crossings or with the installation of culverts that meet fish passage standards and thereby, allow for the easy transportation both of fish and of pickup trucks. So I'm going to pass it back to Erin now to look a little bit into the future, what looking downriver and floodplain management, both in the Pacific Northwest and possibly the nation, is going to look like from here on out.
All right, thanks, Briar. So yeah, let's bring it home by looking downriver. So as we kind of look ahead to from where we are today, obviously we're hopeful that a better awareness of habitat values and natural floodplain function will lead to healthier and safer riverfronts and shorelines far into the future. In the Puget Sound, we're working on continuing our BIOP and RPA implementation and finding ways to improve FEMA's outreach strategies to the local communities. We're also working with our state partners on permitting requirements to make sure that policies aren't overlooked when permitting rules are put in place. And in Oregon, we're continuing with our stakeholder workshops, as I mentioned, and are working hard to make sure that the end result of that planning process is a tool that is designed to be used by and in Oregon communities and tribes. And of course, there's no reality where all rivers will look like these, whether we're looking at the Metolius River, which is a wild and scenic river in the state of Oregon, or the Elwha River, which is famously has recovered in a beautiful way after 2 of its lower dams were removed. What we're really kind of hoping for is something that shows a reality where big changes can be made through remarkable collaboration. A great example of this is the Southern Flow Corridor project. It's a successful partnership between multiple government agencies, community organizations, industries, and even landowners. The project is located in Tillamook Bay, where tidal wetlands are a critical habitat for Oregon coast coho salmon. It's also an area that used to see widespread flooding along Highway 101 and in the town of Tillamook. And yes, that's where the good cheese comes from. The project restored what's called a flow corridor, which allows floodwaters to move freely and quickly away from the town, while also reconnecting hundreds of acres of marsh habitat and restoring 13 miles of tidal channels. We took a drive along the highway last December, and it was really something to see. Most solutions, though, are going to be those that find a better balance between the built and natural environments. A great example of this is one that's not too far from where I sit today, the Quileute Estuary Restoration Project near Marysville, Washington. The Quileute project, which the Tulalip tribes completed in 2015, reintroduced close to 400 acres of restored tidal marsh to the Snohomish River, about 3 miles from its outlet into the Puget Sound. This is both a very important floodplain habitat for supporting endangered salmon species and an area of growing urban and suburban development. It's also an area that's projected to be at risk of rising sea levels and groundwater in the coming decades, so restoration projects happening now are critical for maintaining development safely, managing development safely, while also maintaining habitat for these imperiled species. At the end of the day, projects like these protect development and also get listed species closer to recovery. It's really a win-win. So to wrap up, I want to just make a few more points. First, we know that environmental considerations in floodplains do matter, not just in the Pacific Northwest. Second, ESA considerations are not just an NFIP requirement. There are other paths to compliance with the ESA besides our BIOP implementation. ESA sections 9, 10, and 4D are some examples. And finally, the work that we're doing really is a sign of a paradigm shift and a change from 50 years of ingrained habits. The requirement to address natural and beneficial floodplains has always existed, as Breyer explained, and it's important to start thinking about floodplain management in terms of habitat management, and what's good for fish is good for us. So with that, I'll say thanks and give you our contact information so that you can reach out to myself or to Breyer with any questions. And I guess we're ready to take questions in the virtual conference now. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin and Breyer. We're glad to have you here for our question and answer. And the first question I'd like to ask you is, what hurdles would there be to doing this program nationally, and what do you think would come next?
Sure, I'll take that one. So if we were going to do this on a national scale, which in the comments you see that there is a national consultation going forward, we'd have to make sure that the minimum performance standards were still the basis for a national approach, and that the program going forward wouldn't be geographic specific or species specific. And you know, it would really be a big hurdle. There's 23,000 or so NFIP communities around the country now, and we'd have to make sure that this is something that each of those communities would be able to implement. So that's a big chunk of program to reconsider, but it is a possibility.
All right, great. I think we need to move on for our next presenter, but we really appreciate it. And we also, I forgot to mention in the beginning that we want to thank our H2O partners for sponsoring this. We're going to move on now to the next presenter for Floodways and Original Intent. The presenter is Alan Lulloff, PE CFM from ASFPM.
Good morning. So welcome to the session, Floodways, Reducing the Impact of Surcharge. My name is Alan Lulloff. I'm with the ASFPM Flood Science Center. So welcome. Well, first of all, I'd like to provide some acknowledgements. And the main acknowledgement is to Larry Larson, who I've been with ASFPM for 15 years. And the very first day I arrived with ASFPM, he said that one of the primary issues he wanted me to focus on was the issues with floodway surcharge and reducing the impacts of surcharge floodways. Also want to thank Bill Brown, who's also with ASFPM working on this issue. Dave Carlton helped with some of the research, and Mark Rebow provided some of the historic FEMA memos that provided some background. Also like to acknowledge some other people over the years that have been major advocates for change. Jeff Sickles, Lynn Lovell, John Ivey, Brian Varela, and Del Schwalls. So what is this thing called surcharge? So today we're going to be talking about that, a little bit of the surcharge history, impacts of floodway surcharge, and recommendations to minimize the impacts. So the earliest definition of floodway was in 1969 in the Federal Register. And that in there, it said floodway means the area of the floodplain reasonably required to carry and discharge floodwaters. No mention of surcharge at that time. Then in 1978, this definition was published in the CFR. And as you can read it, basically the floodway was defined as the channel of the river watercourse and the adjacent land areas that must be reserved in order to discharge the base flood without cumulatively increasing the water surface elevation by more than a designated height. And then in section 60.3, it highlights that the community shall select and adopt a regulatory floodway based on the principle the area chosen for the regulatory floodway must be designed to carry waters without increasing the water surface elevation of that flood by more than 1 foot. We highlight select here, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So if you look at the cross-sectional area of a stream, and in one-dimensional modeling, that's what they usually do, is stream cross-sections. They'll, in that one-dimensional model, usually a HEC-RAS model these days, they would block off each side of that cross-section. And as that blockage would occur, that would pinch the flow in and create this rise. And once it met this 1 foot, that would establish where the edge of the floodway would be, and the rest would be flood fringe. Floodway and flood fringe. And the issue is that, of course, that flood fringe, that increase, and by the way, that 1 foot surcharge is not added to the base flood elevation. You'll probably hear that from me several times here. And that extends outside the special flood hazard area as that fringe gets filled. Here's another view of that. Again, the flood fringe. And the key things that when it comes to impacts are really more, the floodway is a good concept. The issue of this extensive amount of flood fringe that's now open to development with no analysis, it becomes available. Now, some of the graphics you'll see associated with this floodway surcharge are inaccurate because, as you can see, this surcharge goes up to here, but that surcharge really extends out into the flood fringe in the real world. This engineering model will have these frictionless walls here created to create that surcharge, but that surcharge will actually go out into the flood fringe. Here's another inaccurate graphic showing a surcharge and then an encroachment, but it implies that this encroachment goes up above the surcharge, where really that encroachment will only be filled to the base flood elevation. Here's a much better graphic that shows that water surface elevation, that 1 foot here, this delta is 1 foot. This is a graphic prepared by the Corps of Engineers for FEMA in '87. And shows that surcharge will extend into the flood fringe and actually out into beyond the special flood hazard area, so much more accurate. Here's a perspective view. There's that surcharge, and it shows it kind of being contained within the floodway, but really that once that filling occurs, that flooding will go into the flood fringe area. So why was this concept of floodway surcharge established? Well, there's a seminal report prepared by James Goddard. James Goddard and Gilbert White are the two people named in the ASFPM Goddard-White Award. And in 1978, he summarized his history of how that rationale and origin occurred. And it occurred over in the 1950s when he was in the Tennessee Valley Authority. So he knows that history. And he said the first consideration in this report, he said, first considering or designating floodways, that all of the floodplain of the selected flooding would be included, except those shallow areas and embayments where there was ponding or little or any flow. So the concept would be basically the natural floodway where there's moving waters. However, this was in the Tennessee Valley, and they had steep slopes, and some people pushed back and said, well, wait a minute, if we can't develop in the floodplain, we won't have any area to develop because of the steep slopes in the Tennessee Valley. So there was a compromise. There was some pushback, and so the compromise was to allow some development. And the approach that allowed encroachment provided would not cause an unreasonable increase in flood heights. And what that evolved into being no more than 1 foot. But he highlighted that it was to be a minimum criteria intended to be a regional standard and would apply, especially in hilly, steep slope areas, recognizing that for urban areas with existing development, a much smaller rise might be appropriately considered. So here's a good graphic on that. Obviously, in hilly areas, a 1 foot surcharge wouldn't extend very far. But in wide, flat floodplain areas, that would go a long, long ways. So, and also we found a historic policy memorandum by Nicholas Lally, highlighted that according to FEMA, the floodway express purpose to provide a tool to ensure new development will not cause any, and notice emphasis added, any adverse impact on existing development. Recognizing the pressures development and engineering judgment applied, the FIA concluded that adverse impact would result when the flood profile was at least 1 foot higher. But he went on to say, bear in mind that this was intended to be a national standard. And again, he highlighted that there are many urban areas where the density of existing development, any measurable rise, and this is not emphasis added, this is memo, any underlying measurable rise might be considered adverse by existing occupants. So highlighting that the early intent was that this would apply in certain areas, but where there's a lot of existing development, that there would a much higher standard would be appropriate. So states then really a number of states by the 70s had floodplain management programs, and they established surcharges that were less than that 1 foot surcharge. 4 states adopted the standard based on the concept of measurable, and at that time the Corps of Engineers modeling produced output at the 1/10 of a foot. So that's what was established. In Wisconsin, when the Corps started producing outputs in hundredths of a foot, they went to a higher standard, and their standard is designated today as 0. So they have a 0 surcharge floodways. 4 other states were kind of intermediate or compromise approaches. Minnesota, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, they allowed a 1/2 foot if there were no structures impacted. So there's some really interesting quotes in Goddard's report where he interviewed states, and some of the responses are here, where Illinois said the overbank of floodplain of most streams in Illinois is quite flat. A small increase can significantly expand the width of the floodplain. Unreasonable economically to allow any increase that subjects previously safe structures to floodwaters. So there again, focused on this no measurable amount. Indiana, a similar quote, there are few topographic restraints on development in Indiana, so there's no real need to view floodplains as the only developable area. Again, if you're in a mountainous area, you may need that, but in other areas, there's really no need to view that as a developable area. Now, what about communities in other states? FEMA does have guidelines that say state higher standards do take precedent. However, they had an issue where a community wanted a zero surcharge floodway. And then when the preliminary map came out, there was a new mayor and said, no, we don't want that. So they now, as of November 2019, state that communities, individual communities can also request a more restrictive floodway. However, other than those 8 states, it's been FEMA's policy to map a floodway using the 1-foot surcharge. They put that floodway on the firm. They say then they'll do another one and give that to the community, but what will show up on the firm is that 1-foot surcharge floodway. And they did that primarily to avoid having to redo the floodway map. There is one exception we're aware of, and that's a cooperating technical partner where they had more ability to kind of choose their own floodway. And even though they're a state that does not have a higher standard, they went with a 1/10 of a foot surcharge floodway. So ASFPM did an analysis that we published in a report in 2013, looking at what are the impacts of that 1-foot surcharge floodway. We looked at 8 case studies across the country, and here are the kind of the results of that, comparing the natural or zero surcharge floodway with the 1-foot surcharge. And you can see the results here. Not only did we look at the decrease in width, but also what that did to the velocity and how much it extended the floodplain. And I worked in Wisconsin for many of my years, and with the zero surcharge floodway, I was really surprised how significant a 1-foot surcharge shrunk the width of the floodway. On average, it shrunk it by 50% or halfway. It increased the velocity by 33% and increased the size of the floodplain by 10% on average. We only had 2 examples of where we mapped the increase because that's where we had topo that would allow us to do that. So it's not a very representative or statistically valid analysis, obviously, but it did give us a little bit of a peek at how much larger it makes the floodplain. So here's an example of in Wisconsin. This is in Dane County. This is a zero surcharge floodway, and you can see there's still some flood fringe here mapped. But now, if you look at the 1-foot surcharge, notice how much that shrinks that natural floodway in to reduce the width. And also the red line here shows the amount of increased area that will get flooded over time as that flood fringe gets filled. So again, the 1-foot surcharge, the big issue with the 1-foot surcharge is the floodway concept is a good one because it's restrictive standards for building in the floodplain. But it opens up that flood fringe to be filled with no analysis of the impacts. Now here then, this graphic actually shows that surcharge not going here, and here's a new house that's been built on fill up above the base flood elevation, so that's not flooded, but that's not really the way it works. If you look at the effects of fill in the flood fringe, this one is a better analysis because it shows that existing development will get flooded by this 1-foot surcharge, but also you can kind of see here it floods this new development because that's only built to the base flood elevation, and the surcharge is not added to the base flood. And the logic in that is this is a flood insurance program, and you can't require insurance based on future conditions, according to legal at FEMA. So what is, that 1 foot was not deemed, was deemed reasonable and not deemed significant. But here, if you look at this is a Corps of Engineers flood depth damage curve. Here's 1 foot of surcharge. If you go up to about here, that's 23% of the structure will be damaged by 1 foot of flooding. So if you have a $100,000 house, that's $23,000 worth of damage. If it's $1 million house, that's $230,000 worth of damage on that structure. That seems pretty significant. I did get a kick out of this FEMA tote that they provided at ASFPM in Cleveland, and that highlights the potential impacts of a bit of flooding. Here it just talks about 1 inch. So the impacts of fill on the natural floodway, it increases velocities, a higher flood hazard is deeper and higher, moving faster. It also causes more erosion potential of the stream. So we looked at the guidelines, and one of the things we highlighted is that it says in the guidelines there should be a floodway coordination meeting where you discuss the floodway concepts with the community. I'm not sure that that's happening regularly. And in the CFR, we noted earlier that community shall select and adopt a regulatory floodway. If you look at what Webster says the meaning of select, it means when you're given options to choose the best for your purpose. And so Minnesota has the best practice that I'd like to highlight here. And that what they do is they have a half-foot surcharge, remember, and they will allow that as long as if it will not materially increase flood damage potential. And they interpret that as no increase allowed if there's an existing insurable structure impact. So much of the urban areas of the Twin Cities, those have zero surcharge floodways because there's such significant amount of existing development that would be impacted. Here's a set 1977, so they've been doing this for decades, a technical report on floodways, and it's again highlights that half a foot. They encourage that communities go with a zero surcharge floodway, and they have the process for community selection of the floodway, which designates a floodway basin, but it's verified not to cause more than half an increase or impact existing buildings. So it gives them a process to select something other than a half a foot if there's and only allow that half a foot if there's no existing buildings impacted. And that makes logical sense. And it makes logical sense for FEMA too, since they're underwriting the flood insurance for communities in the special flood hazard area. So we've got some recommendations on limiting the impacts of surcharge. One is that have that floodway coordination meeting with the community where you give them options. Have the community select the floodway, and in our opinion, they should be given the opinion to select the surcharge, promote a zero surcharge floodway. And then if they do go with that surcharge, that they should be required to notify owners of structures that are impacted, similar to the conditional letter of map revision process. Which makes sense. If you're going to create a map that's going to cause some flooding for existing development, they should probably be notified of that impact. And going to a better, we kind of use the basic better no adverse impact approach like we do in much of our no adverse impact analyses. The better is to do a risk assessment where you provide a fully encroached map to show what that additional inundation will be caused by that surcharge. How much area is going to additionally get flooded because of this? If you're in the Red River of the North, the Dakotas, that's going to go a long ways. Again, here we suggest provide the zero surcharge floodways as the default and only allow a surcharge if no structures were impacted. And after all, FEMA is underwriting the insurance for these structures. And then we've kind of listed no adverse impact approach, where in Wisconsin, a good best practice is Wisconsin has a zero surcharge floodway. They will allow a floodway, a surcharge for certain encroachments, but they require easements to be obtained from property owners impacted by surcharge. So this could be bare land, but if they again are going to be impacted by not having some flooding on their property, so easements are required. And we also suggest that if you're going to do a hazardous run, do it for the BFE plus the BFE and surcharge. Again, the BFE is not added to the surcharge. So by giving two hazardous runs, you actually end up with a monetary amount of that increased damage that's going to potentially occur as that fringe is filled. The other issue is managing development in the floodplain, and one of the concerns we have is that FEMA's approach now is that since you have to do a zero rise analysis for any proposed encroachment, there can be no cumulative impacts because 0 plus 0 equals 0. Well, in actuality, most people know that the sensitivity to the modeling is such that it is not really 0. There's a little bit of an impact that may not be, the computer program may not be able to pick up. So 0 plus 0 plus 0 does not equal 0. And specifically based on the fact that once you allow somebody to encroach 100 feet into the floodplain, you can't deny the next person to do the same thing. So you've established a legal precedent. And so here's a great graphic from a historic FEMA document that depicts that, and it's an excellent graphic showing that. We also wanted to highlight a best practice. The city of Brevard in Transylvania County, North Carolina, which, by the way, I get a big kick out of, Transylvania County. I didn't know there was such a county, but it is. And instead of a no rise certification, they require no adverse impact certification associated with any proposed encroachments, meaning no increase in elevation or velocity or erosion. So I'm an engineer, and if somebody gives me a task of showing a no rise by changing the Manning's N by cutting down vegetation and paving something, I can show a no rise, but I can't show a no increase in velocity. So it really more effectively is a restriction on development in the floodway. Again, it's not a restriction that says you can't develop, it's a performance standard based on both elevation and velocity. And so finally, the other thing to really look at for managing development is you should be looking at loss of storage and also make sure there's no impacts on floodplain habitat. ASFPM has developed some no adverse impact how-to guides. I'd like to highlight 2 of them here. If you go up to the ASFPM website and click on no adverse impacts, you can get to these guides. There's, I think, 7 of them that have been developed. Here are 2 specifically related to these issues. One is one on hazard identification and floodplain mapping, and the other is on regulations and development standards. And finally, I'd like to credit Jeff Sickles here. He, at an ASFPM conference in 2008, had a presentation, and this was one of his slides, and I just love it because it highlights that we've been kind of going down this road for decades, and really a lot of it does not make logical sense. Also want to highlight the ASFPM Flood Science Center. We will have a booth at the conference here, and if there's questions that can't be answered in a question and answer period after this presentation, I will be at the booth, and you can come and ask me additional questions if you wish. Finally, with this hot weather that everybody's facing, I thought people might have a little refreshing view of my dog enjoying the snow this last winter in Wisconsin. Not everybody dislikes the snow in Wisconsin, and obviously my dog does not. So with that, opening it up for questions, and thank you very much.
So thank you, Alan. So Alan is here with us live to answer some of your questions. And the first question we're going to go to is, has the floodway concept been challenged legally?
Yes, it has. There's been a number of cases, particularly out east and also in Vermont, where the floodway regs in Vermont, they went all the way to their state Supreme Court, and they actually allow floodway to be designated based on more of an erosion standard. But the bottom line is we had legal analysis done. Sam Medlock did, Ed Thomas and Sam Medlock did some research, and basically highlighted a number of ordinances. Another ordinance was occurred out in the state of Washington in Pierce County, where their a mobile home was went to their Supreme Court and also was validated. So yes, the answer is yes, and we've got documents on our website that highlight that.
Okay, great. Next question is, should there be an extra ordinance or regs for structures built in the fringe, such as freeboard requirement to incorporate the surcharge?
Yeah, that's excellent. A lot of communities do build freeboard requirements into their regulations. In Minnesota, for instance, what they do is they have a state 1 foot freeboard requirement, and then they add the surcharge. If there's a surcharge developed for a community, they'll add that surcharge to their freeboard. So in some cases, they'll have a 1.5 foot of freeboard requirement. So that's an excellent requirement to put in your regulations. It does not address the fact that it will extend out beyond the floodplain, and it does not address the issue of impacts on existing buildings. And so that's where we think it's important that there be notification of existing development of the impacts.
Okay, thank you. So new development that requires 3 feet of fill in a large AO2 zone plus 1 foot freeboard will have a major impact on existing development, compromise, or too bad. So do we make a compromise on that, or is it just too bad? Do you want me to read that again?
AO zone. Well, if you're talking about AO zone, that's a little different. AO zone is a shallow flooding area, and that is not really kind of a component of the floodway standards. The floodway standards is primarily the floodway and flood fringe. So AO zones don't really apply to the kind of the floodplain requirements, but anytime you add fill to the floodplain, it's usually has a negative impact, and especially considering the previous presentation, it highlights the issue of impacting the natural and beneficial functions.
All right. So we had one observation here, and I don't know if you want to comment. It said, Illinois utilizes the following to determine a floodway: surcharge cannot exceed 0.1, reduce volume by greater than 10%, or increase velocity 10%. What's your thoughts on that?
That is, I am aware of that, and would have been. I wish I would have highlighted that now. That's an excellent standard because it does address the issue of increased velocity. It's the only one really on the books that I'm aware of that adequately, other than the city of Brevard, where they take into account velocity and the issue of reducing volume. Now, their 10% standard is not quite as stringent as the city of Brevard, but it does can significantly reduce the impacts by including that component. So I highly recommend something like that. And if people want to apply something like that, that would be great to go to Illinois and use their ordinance as a model. Okay,
great. So I just had one other comment someone has said in here. They said, thank you and appreciate the background and the video of your happy puppy. So that was great.
Glad they enjoyed it. This goes to show you that Wisconsin, we do enjoy snow sometimes. So appreciate that very much.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, Alan. And thank you, our H2O partners, for sponsoring this session. And we are going to move on to our next session. We have coming up we have shifting from binary to graduated, a view of the flood risk and 100-year standard, past and future. And the presenter is Phetmano, oh boy, I'm terrible, Phannavong, sorry if I slaughtered your name, I'm very sorry. And we will be heading into that now, I believe.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. Again, my name is Phannavong, and I'm glad to be presenting you today of my research and some thought about the 100-year flood standard at this 2020 ASFPM conference. And we will be discussing floodplain management policies at this session. This presentation, again, will be focusing on the 100-year standard. The topic of the presentation include timelines of the 100-year flood standard, cooperative federalism concept of the NFIP, challenges and opportunity looking at this standard, and also some thought on rethinking minimum NFIP requirements. And I know this is a lot, and I will summarize and give you some key takeaways at the end, and also allow some times for Q&A at the end. In this presentation, I would use the term 100 years standard or 100-year floodplain instead of 1% annual chance for consistency. And I believe the audience of this session would already have some knowledge and understanding the differences and the reason why we use certain terms. So I will stick with 100-year standard for consistency. The 100-year flood standard had a long history, as you can see here. The way that I want you to look at it, looking at starting from 1968 and something before and after. As you know, the National Flood Insurance Program was created by the Act in 1968. The Act itself is silent on the standard when it passed in 1968. However, before that, there's many standards that had been used by other federal agencies, state and local government, namely the Tennessee Valley Authority had been use different standard for their project. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been used it for different project under the Flood Control Act. And by 1950s, there are so many standards, including local and state, had been used, including the 100-year flood standard. The same year, in 1968, the HUD, who was the floodplain administrator at that time, worked with or funded University of Chicago to host a seminar, also known as the Chicago Seminar, in December of the same year, to gather experts from around the country to help HUD to come up with what standards to be used for the National Flood Insurance Program. The outcome of the seminar, the experts suggested the 100-year flood should be the standard apply to be used for the program. In terms of legislation and rulemaking process, not until 1969, basically a year after that, the word 100-year floodplain has been shown up in the rulemaking for a definition of a special flood hazard area. However, it's not until 1971, toward the end of 1971, with a new final rulemaking that set the 100-year flood as the regulatory elevation standard for the NFIP. As you can see here, subsequent years, many legislation passed to add into the program, namely the 1973 Act that established mandatory purchase requirement. 1977, the President Carter issued Executive Order 11988. In fact, this particular executive order supersede the previous one in 1966, and 296. One key piece of legislation that or law that I want to point out here is the Bigger Waters of 2012 that established TMAC, the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, and also consider the climate and future condition risk in the program for the first time. Since 1968, 1971, there are many efforts that try to or try to evaluate the 100-year flood standard, either try to decrease it or increase it. Namely here, I put it here is 1983 when the Reagan administration through OMB asked FEMA to look at the standard, and the outcome of that FEMA recommended and OMB agreed to keep the 100-year standard. Essentially, is nothing wrong with that, and no point to spend more money to come up with a new standard. And in 2004, in fact, the Gilbert White National Flood Policy Forum held the forum looking at the 100-year standard at that time, and 2 years later, the American Institute for Research, funded by FEMA, issued a report in 2006 of the 100-year standard. I want to give some summary of the Flood Policy Forum in 2004. There are many key findings and recommendations of that forum, of the report, but I wanted to highlight several things here that I found it interesting that the forum found. One of them is, the forum said the 100-year standard is very well institutionalized by all level of governments. It has been supported by many case law and many activities and initiative programs by federal, state, and local have been used as standard. However, the forum recognized the challenges of this in and out nature of the standard. We have a 100-year floodplain line, and either you are in or you are out. If you're in, the perception that you are at risk and you should do something about it, and when you're out, you are safe. You don't need to do something to mitigate. And what happened is that over time, people attempted to get out of that line or to remove that line away from their property. There are three key recommendations I want to point it out here that the forum suggests that, instead of come up with a new standard, we should enhance the approach, how we come up with the 100-year floodplain or flood elevation. One of them is, why don't we use the future conditions hydrology, looking at the build-out condition, build-out development throughout the watershed to come up with future condition hydrology and flood elevation. The second recommendation was, how about apply two-tiered standard, right? Like keep 100-year standards the same what it is, and impose a new 500-year standards for certain type of uses and activities. Think about Executive Order 11988, essentially, that we have to apply or use 500-year standard for critical action or activity of the federal projects. And lastly, found it interesting here is, why don't we apply benefit cost or risk-based model to any development or any project, like looking at the type of project, look at the location, and find the optimal point where the benefit cost and ratio is the best for the projects. So in this approach, you would have different standards for different projects, so that there will be multiple standard apply to this concept. Looking this lead to a conversation that I want to have is the concept of cooperative federalism, where as we know, the National Flood Insurance Program is a voluntary program, right? It was created under this concept of cooperative federalism, where all level of government have roles and responsibility in the program, and they were agreeing with each other to work toward some goal of the program. When this program was created, Congress had this concept in mind, recognizing that U.S. federal government has certain powers and state and local government has certain power. How can we work together to address flood losses in the nation? The federal government has in the U.S. Constitution, we call enumerated powers, that essentially power that listed in the U.S. Constitution itself. Here, what I mean is the Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. This power has, have their name, and some of them you may know, like the Commerce Clause power, the Taxing and Spending Clause of power, and the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is another power of the U.S. Federal government. On the other hand, the state and local government have this called state police power, that they can establish and enforce laws that protecting the welfare, safety, and health of the public. This is a very term that you probably have seen and heard. This type of laws include the land use regulations. That's the key there. This police power is derived from the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, stating that the power that is not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the state or to the people. So I just want to leave this concept with you there when we kind of think through this the program and how we can look at the what's coming in the future. Two Supreme Court cases that I just want to bring it up. I found it, it might be interesting to give you some context. One of them is the South Dakota v. Doe in 1987. This case is about federal minimum drinking age of 21. The federal government is in this case is using a federal highway fund as a condition for South Dakota, the state of South Dakota, to adopt a minimum drinking age of 21. At that time, it was, I believe, it's 18. And of course, state of South Dakota didn't like it and sued the federal government and bring the case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled or held that Congress actually can do that with their taxing and spending power to put this condition, in order for you to receive our federal grant, this is what you need to do. And we have seen this power have been playing out with so many grant programs. The second case is New York v. United States in 1992. This case is about the low-level radioactive waste law that made state take the title and be liable if they don't get rid of them at a certain date. And it's a federal law that imposed that condition that, of course, state of New York didn't like it, again, sued the federal government and take the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court say, yes, Congress can encourage state to implement federal policy. Here's a grant, we want you to do this X, Y, and Z. But the Supreme Court stated, but Congress cannot commandeer, that's the term that they use, or compel state to do so. So that the case, is about that you, yes, encourage, but not compel. The court has set a test, the criteria to make determination. If you want to learn more about it, we can talk offline about that. You may ask, how about local government? Can federal government compel or commandeer local government or not? In another case, later on, Prince of the United States extend the concept of anti-commandeering doctrines to the local government. Since the adoption of the 100-year standard, although many good things are happening in floodplain management that we know, but there are many challenges that we also know. Three of them I want to highlight here out of the report that I just mentioned earlier, and also the recent GAO report. The AIR, or American Institute for Research, pointed out that the use of the 100-year flood standard actually encourages the construction of the levee to the 100-year standard for the purpose to remove property out of the floodplain. And this is a perception that once the levee is certified, the area behind it would be protected and would be no risk. The second challenges that was pointed out by Flood Policy Forum is that because of the 100-year standard, now development is basically tended to build along the outside of the special flood hazard area. As I mentioned, the concept of in and out, even try to, over the years, even try to be outside, just outside of the line. I mean, that's what essentially that's what the reports say, that now we see a lot of houses and development just outside of the floodplain. Lastly, last month, the GAO issued a report pointing out that implementation and enforcement of the program are not that easy for the community and also for FEMA to enforce. And enforcement, it needs a lot of effort, a lot of resources, and punishing the community is just too severe that is a very hard thing to do. There is an opportunity that I want to bring up here, that to help us to rethink this 100-year flood standard, right? And then how the future would be. We have seen challenges, and the standard has been created 50 years ago, and maybe it's a way to step back or to slow down to think about this, right? In the TMAC, or the Technical Mapping Advisory Council 2019 last year report, the TMAC was tasked to look at the future of the flood hazard mapping program for FEMA, and 4 areas that TMAC is focusing on was to the shifting the binary, the in and out concept to the graduated view of the flood risk, and also looking at the role of state and local community, and including private sector. The other 2 include, how do we access the data, how we modernize the program so that we can be more efficient. This year, TMAC continue working on this element and also seeking input from stakeholders. For the future of the 100-year standard, we need to look at the program here more comprehensively, right? Like by rethinking again, what are the roles and responsibility of local state government besides the federal government, and what are minimum requirements for the program for the community to participate. What I'm talking about here is, my view is that the new standard may not be necessarily a higher standard, like 500-year standard or any higher kind of standard, but maybe we need to look at different standard altogether that help to achieve the goal of the program. New minimum, I call it new minimum NFIP standard, may consider multiple hazards, right? Like such as urban flooding, the future condition flood hazard, in order to manage this flood risk in a more holistic approach, and also look at as the structure kind of level risk rather than by zone that we have. This concept, it can be possible now because of the technology and science. Now it has been improved and has been utilized and available to us to use that were not back in early 2000 or even 5 years ago, right? Second, the new minimum standard requirement may focus more on the land use planning in order to make floodplain or flood risk management more localized, and that increase the ownership and the responsibility of the local government. We can promote integration, which we have been doing for many years now, in terms of integrate hazards and risks into local planning, like comprehensive plan, the capital improvement plan, and other plans that communities are interested in improving their community. Lastly, the requirement we may have to look at more flexible and workable options for the community. Concept here that I leave it here, I may not be able to expand much. The concept of performance-based regulations, instead of be more prescriptive, we look at, a criteria so that community can meet. Thinking about the community rating system, for example, of this concept. So I know there's a lot there, so I will leave some 3 key takeaways here to take home. First is that the NFIP was created under the cooperative federalism, so it's all level of governments that have roles and responsibility in the program. Secondly, the 100-year standard was selected as the standard of the program is based on compromise in 1968, and it was a point of departure for adjustment, meaning is we need to come up with a standard to work with so that over time we can continue improve and adjust to the local condition and what community want to do to add more or to improve into the standard. Since then, we have better knowledge in terms of science and technology. So maybe it's time to reconsider this, again, 100-year standard by rethinking what minimum of the program requirement would be that would emphasize more on the land use planning and importantly, provide something that's flexible and workable for the community in order to achieve the NFIP goals. So thank you for your attention. I'm open for questions and further discussion on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Phetmano. Really appreciate that presentation. And we have time for a question for you now. Have there been any states that don't use higher standards?
Yes, there are, many states and I would say communities, right? Like we have currently the National Flood Insurance Program has the minimum standard but allow the community and certain state agency, I guess, to be able to adopt higher standard. That's the concept I talked about, the cooperative federalism of the program that, federal set minimum standard and then state and local community can adopt higher standard, right? And that, that's been the system that we have been working with, that is the higher standard, certain communities, certain state kind of adopt higher standard because they see the value, they see the risk that they need to manage. But the question is, how can we, with the new sort of thinking that I just shared my thought, how do we deal with certain community have, different standards, some higher than other, how do we deal with that? I think we need to kind of step back from this 100-year standard as the minimum standard, right? Like the last point that I made there, being flexible and workable for community. So we need to create a system that we have a goal, bigger goal, and that we try to meet, and then maybe provide some flexibility for community to reach that goal. Some community can adopt, certain standards, certain way of doing things that fit with their community. So rather than be rigid about what community needs to follow, but allow them to be creative, looking through, from planning, from design consideration to construction and plannings, and among other things, like community engagement. So think about, again, this is kind of my view, right? I'm not imposed that this is going to work well and it's going to happen overnight, but I think we need to start to think about this, and because of things are changing with technologies that we have, with the lots of data and risks and hazard data that we're going to have, so how we can maximize those data in different part of the community, like comprehensive planning and emergency response and community engagement, and talk about, and also insurance as well. So I know that it might be simplified it, but just think about community rating system, right? Like think about the concept of community rating system that we have and certain community adopted, that, it could be like community have adopt a lot of things that add into that become a minimum requirements. Again, this is just kind of one idea that, to make a point, but rather than just, you have to build at certain elevation for certain building, I think that it's been difficult for communities, and certain communities it's hard to implement.
Sure, no, I can get that. So I know you have an event that you wanted to mention.
Yes, I know that there's a lot of questions here that I may not be able to answer, and Atkins has a virtual booth throughout this conference, and for today, at 3 o'clock, I will be there, and I hope that some of you may be able to join us, and then we can have a conversation there. Hopefully, we can, if many of you interested to talk more about this concept and this idea, and I want to, have that conversation, maybe we can create a separate chat room so that we can have more conversation. And again, want to get some thought of you as well. One thing that I didn't have a chance to talk much about, I blame COVID for this, right? I couldn't go to the Library of Congress law library after March, so it's a lot of research that has been, I don't have full research to be able to talk more in detail particular, like, the federal rulemaking process. I want to dig a little bit deeper on that, and the concept of the performance-based regulations. I think something that I want to look into a little bit more. There's some pros and cons on that. A lot of you may think that, it's a bad idea, or some of you may say it's a good idea. So I want to expand that a little bit. And my goal of all this research is going to be a paper at some point. So I just, want to have that conversation with many of you here as well during this conference. Thank
Oh,
you.
great. That will be an interesting conversation. I look forward to that paper that you're going to write as well. So everybody that wants to, there are more questions and wants to have input for what you're working on, go over and talk with him. And we thank you very much. We want to thank our H2O partners for sponsoring this session. And don't forget to make it out to the first plenary session coming up very soon. And thank you, and have a great conference.
Thank you.